4. On the Ab's-Eli conflict, Israeli myths on the Arab defeat in June 1967 repeated some of those that emerged after the 1948 war, especially that of the few against the many, or a sea of enemies. The results of the June 1967 war changed Israel. For example, Israeli political culture and ideology led towards an increasingly intimate fusion of nationalism and religio-political radicalism. The Israeli economy was reinforced with foreign investments, American aid and closer strategic cooperation with the US, and Israel found itself ruling directly over an entire society comprised of millions of Palestinians who were not only subjects of military rule, but also a market for Israeli commodities and a source for cheap labor. Moreover, the post-war dialectic of victory and defeat, epitomized in the arrogance and triumphalism expressed by one side and the humiliation and degradation felt by the other, led to the War of 1973. The losers were driven by a need to restore national dignity, while the winners, in their euphoria, could not envision that their defenses might not withstand an Arab attack. The issue to a peace strategy in the Arab world occurred only after the October 1973 war. But that was met with the simultaneous share to the far right in Israel after 1967 and the further consolidation of the bilateral alliance between it and the US. Sadat's separate peace agreement with Israel would mark the beginning of an official Arab disengagement from the Palestinian cause as a source of bilateral connectivity between Arab states and Israel. But the Egyptian model peace with Israel in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from occupied Egyptian territories could not become a model for the Palestinians. June War syndromes. After the June 1967 war, in which Israel occupied territories of 3 Arab countries along with the rest of Palestine, Israel added the myth of being caught in a constant defensive war, which automatically legitimizes any preemptive war or a war of no choice Israel launches to its propaganda arsenal. The overwhelming dominance of the Israeli war narrative in the Western media, at least for some time after 1967, proved the thesis of the discursive hegemony of the winner's narrative. 2. 95. Palestinians were displaced again. Thousands of refugees became refugees for a second time, in some cases a repetition of the types of war crimes committed in 1948. Villages, Imres, Yarlu and Beit Nuber, 4 and the city of Kalkalir 5 were ethnically cleansed during the 1967 war. However, Israel did not proceed to full-scale ethnic cleansing, and most of the population continued to live under direct Israeli occupation, a factor that played a decisive role in changing the character of the Palestinian issue. After 1948, the question of Palestine, internationally, became synonymous with the refugee issue. After 1967, attempts were made to reduce it to an issue of occupied territories. Both remain unresolved. The Palestinians' national cause comprises both the cause of the refugees and the problem of the occupied territories, and more. Are the product of the settler colonial project in Palestine, the origin of these concerns and the Arab-Israeli connectivity that, for decades, Israel sought to separate from the Palestinian question. There was no Arab-Israeli connectivity before a Zionist state was declared on the ruins of the Arab people who lived there. At the time the 1967 war broke out, there were no occupied Arab territories except Palestine itself. Neither Egypt's Sinai nor Syria's Golan Heights were under Israeli occupation, both were occupied in 1967. A drive to promote peace agreements with Israel in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from these territories was a drive to distort history. Its success implied that Israel achieved that war's political goals. Contrary to the claims of many 1967 war historians and analysts, the military connectivity was neither inevitable nor preemptive nor defensive. For Israel, it was a war of choice. Archival evidence indicates that the Americans, Soviets, and Israelis were certain that Israel would score a comprehensive victory due to its overwhelming military superiority. As Roland Popp put it, the initiation of hostilities by Israel itself was certainly not an example of statesmen somehow losing control of the political process, but a clear-cut rational decision in a situation where the balance of forces made military defeat virtually impossible. 7. An increasing amount of evidence belies the claim that there was an impending Arab act that needed preempting. Military escalation between Egypt and Israel lost momentum by the last week of May, and neither took any further action that risked restarting the escalation. Documents also 96 show that Egypt's military deployment to the Sinai was limited and merely demonstrative, 8. Amounting to nothing even remotely resembling an invasion. Force 9. Nasser's orders to limit the troop amassment in the Sinai were viewed by some American senior officials as a sign of peaceful intentions, and that he would not begin any GHT. 10. It was the provocative Egyptian rhetoric that was confusing. As it turns out, this was the product of one-upmanship in the context of the leadership rivalry in Egypt between the President Nasser and his Chief of Staff Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amr. 11. And in the context of the pan-Arab nationalist competition between the Egyptian, Syrian, and Saudi leaderships. None of them wanted to go to war, but all of them wanted to look calm and resolute while accusing the others of weakness before the enemy. Israel's leadership was divided between two camps: the hardline proponents of an immediate strike, mostly including army generals, politicians, and ex-commanders such as Moshe Dayan, who became defense minister during the crisis, and their doves like then Prime Minister Eshkol and Foreign Minister Eben. Doves were mainly worried about the negative consequences of a potential repeat of the Suez Crisis experience of 1956, when the superpowers intervened to stop the tripartite invasion of Egypt. However, the US had changed to a more explicit strategic pro-Israeli footing in the past decade, in addition to growing animosity towards Arab nationalist regimes. So, the other camp could argue that Washington would support an Israeli war against Arab nationalist regimes considered pro-Soviet, and that superpower intervention by either the Americans or the Soviets was unlikely. Hardliners prevailed. 12. While it is true that both Jordan and Iraq joined the Joint Defense Treaty between Syria and Egypt just few days before the Israeli RST strike, this treaty was clearly defensive. It essentially pulled treaties signed in the 1950s out of the drawer, and these had never been truly activated and had very little impact. In fact, on the eve of the war, there were no signs of inter-Arab coordination at all. Shortly before the signing of the treaty, Nasser accused King Hussein of Jordan of being a CIA agent, while Jordan broke off diplomatic relations with Syria. Syria was opposed to the inclusion of Jordan in the treaty to begin with and refused to coordinate its policies with Egypt. When the escalation started, Nasser was at the height of his popularity in Jordan, so Hussein joined the treaty with his Egyptian rival for fear public anger might turn against him if he 97 did not. For the very same reasons, he joined the war few days later. As Curtius concluded, the treaty was more or less a faint policy declaration, rather than a robust framework for war preparations. 13. In short, the Arab states on the eve of the war were not preparing to attack Israel. Were busy exchanging accusations and campaigning against each other. Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol knew this. So did the hardline generals, who launched a sensationalist media campaign warning that a second Holocaust would happen if Israel did not attack RST. In so doing, they effectively executed a public putsch 14 against the Prime Minister. A parenthetical remark may be in order here. It was at this crucial juncture that the political instrumentalization of the Holocaust, an integral state strategy today, began in earnest. Menachem Begin, the Likud leader who became the Prime Minister of Israel in 1977, brought it to a new peak in his public speeches and addresses. Prior to 1967 war, according to David Biarli, the Zionist version of Jewish history created a gulf between the diaspora Jews of Europe and their new Hebrews of Israel. Israeli official commemorations of the Holocaust mainly focused on the few acts of resistance, like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. It emphasized the difference between those who took up arms against the Nazis, OEN incorrectly alluded to as Zionists in the sub-narrative, and all the other Jews that were led, as the Zionist rhetoric put it, like sheep to the slaughter. 15E imagery was consistent with how Zionist ideology depicted diaspora Jews as passive and cast Zionism as a revolt against this passivity. 16A the June 1967 war, however, this ideology was superseded by an ideology of survival, whereby Zionism no longer constituted a break with Jewish history, but rather its continuation under different conditions. 17 From this perspective, the Jewish state has led to contradictory feelings of innate power and exaggerated fear. 18 is ideological share, which was characterized by a growing use of Holocaust allusions and metaphors in the national discourse, implied that Jews lived in eternal isolation and faced a permanent existential threat to their survival. 19 Such discourse gave rise to two corollaries, at least for right-wing nationalists. ERST was that Israel, the exclusive agent of Jewish history, was the consummate victim. Second held that it was futile to make concessions for peace because the threat would always be there. Conclusion, perpetual. 98. Military empowerment and absolute force superiority is the only way to guarantee of Israel's future security. As tensions between the Arabs and Israel escalated, there were calls from Israeli society to appoint Ben-Gurion 20 as Prime Minister and Moshe Dayan as Defense Minister, and the latter was appointed in the end. However, even Ben-Gurion, who believed in the necessity of a second war with the Arabs because the 1948 war was not sufficient to force them to accept Israel, was among those who urged waiting for commitment from the two superpowers before going to war. He suggested to dig in and wait, remembering the 1956 intervention of the Soviet Union and the US. Eshkol thought that he had satisfied the generals by giving them the budgets they requested to build a modern army. As Eshkol observed, you did not receive all of these weapons so that one day you sit and say, now we can annihilate the Egyptian army. Yet, according to Guy Laron, that was exactly their intention, and the intended purpose of building a modern offensive army. Weapons were purchased to build an offensive army that was capable of expanding Israeli borders. 21 One could agree with some or most of the technical analysis of Kenneth Pollock concerning the military performance of the Arab armies in 1967-22, are eliminating the cultural generalizations implicit in the categorization of Arab armies, but the facts refute his book's initial assertion that, on the eve of the war, Israel was a goner. 23 His assessment takes at face value the sensationalist propaganda and fear-mongering that were part of the Israeli army leadership's campaign against Eshkol's hesitation to launch an offensive. 24 In his conversation with Israeli Foreign Minister Aber Eban, who was sent by Eshkol to ensure American commitment to support Israel against possible Soviet intervention, without which Eshkol would not go to war despite the pressure from the generals, President Johnson expressed certainty that Israel would win the war. 25 Pentagon and the CIA made similar assessments that Israel would easily win, whether it launched an offensive or absorbed a RST strike. Pentagon estimated that Israel would win in 7 to 10 days in the event of an offensive, and in 2 to 3 weeks in the case of a defensive war or an Egyptian RST strike. A CIA report, released in April 2004, refuted Israeli claims concerning its relative weakness compared to Nasser's Arab coalition and 99. Asserted the counterclaim that Israel had exaggerated Arab strength in order to obtain more aid. CIA, at the time, estimated that the Israeli Air Force would prevail in the RST 24 hours and that Israel would win the war in less than a week. 26 June 1967 war was an Israeli war of choice. Israel seized an opportunity to break Nasser's regime and expand its own borders at the same time. Since 1948, Zionist statesmen and political leaders, out of the belief that the Arab states would not accept the existence of a Jewish state, held that another war was necessary in order to force the Arab states to at least accept Israel as a fait accompli in the region. A war would simultaneously enable Israel to attain some of the territorial goals the 1948 war left unaccomplished. In his debate with Shimon Peres over the 1982 Lebanon War, when the Labour Party claimed that Begin and Sharon's Likud government led the country into a war of choice in Lebanon, Ariel Sharon refuted Peres' claims that Israel should only wage wars of no choice. Sharon, with his typical bluntness, said that only the Jewish rebellion in Auschwitz was a no choice action, otherwise all Israel's wars with the Arabs were wars of choice. 27 implies that, in this respect, the 1967 war was no different from the 1982 war. The apparent difference is between the self-righteous hypocrisy of Labour and Laist Zionists and the unabashed directness of the right-wing nationalists. In October 1953, in an assessment of the security problems of Israel in the event of the outbreak of a future war, Ben-Gurion stressed that the factor of time is decisive and fateful. Since Israel lacks any strategic depth, this means that not only should it assure air dominance by destroying the enemy air force and to bomb its aid services, but it also should decide the time of the wars. Outbreak. 28 point of view subsequently became a national security doctrine that prevailed on the eve of the June 1967 war. 29 Just as there is a defeat syndrome, there is a victory syndrome. The war of 1967 ended in a crushing defeat for all the states act in the Israeli blitzkrieg. Nakser, setback, as the defeat was named by official Egyptian rhetoric, took a whole Arab generation hostage. It precipitated an outpouring of angry critiques of Arab nationalist regimes as well as the tentative rise of the Arabla and a subsequent surge in Islamist movements. Since that time, the wrong questions continued to be asked. It is seldom pointed out that the defeat was actually the exception, not the rule. Pro. 100. Capitulation camp are not interested in rational analysis because the notion that 1967 is the paradigm for any future war with Israel supports their argument for a peace settlement at any cost, as if the only conceivable form of CONICT with a colonial apartheid-like entity is war. Islamist movements clung to the belief that the 1967 defeat was the inevitable result of the commitments of some Arab states to nationalist secular ideologies. EY went so far as trying to prove that Israel won because it holds strictly to the principles of Jewish religion. 30 In fact, Arab armies have fought much better on many occasions since 1967, even under the same regimes. 31 For example, just months after the defeat, Jordanian soldiers and Palestinian Fedayeen supported by a Jordanian artillery battalion proved themselves very capable actors at the Battle of Kararmeh. 32 was followed by the War of Arishan and the 1973 October War, in which the Arab armies acquitted themselves very well despite their different political leaderships. There are the many successes of the long resistance period in Lebanon. Yet, none of these observable achievements have been able to erase the deep-seated impressions bequeathed by the June 1967 defeat. It is, in part, due to the ongoing reality of the Israeli occupation created by that war and, in part, because the deep sense of frustration and despair engendered by the defeat cast a long shadow over any later sense of achievement. The illusion that Sui victory was the Israeli army's constant companion asserted a similarly long-lasting effect on the Israeli psyche and created an ideological bent. Also, it quickly proved a formidable handicap. Whenever the Israelis confronted a serious resistance movement, as in Lebanon and in Gaza, they became perplexed, frustrated and, most importantly, lacking in endurance. EY could not understand why a similarly quick and low-cost victory eluded them in these contexts. The steadfastness displayed by an Arab resistance movement ran contrary to the dominant expectations of an Israeli political culture and collective consciousness shaped by the successes of their Six-Day War. Until its 1967 victory, Israel was an unstable enterprise in the eyes of its Western allies, including the US. Ewin pushed Israel fully into the American radar, paving the way for a deep and comprehensive alliance between the two countries. 33. Same applied to Israel's relationship with diaspora Jews, to whom the war's outcome meant that Israel was more than just a brief 101 adventure, it was now a guaranteed state project. As a result, the end of the war ushered in intensified Jewish migration to Israel, an exponential increase in investments and an extensive liberalization of Israel's tactical, settlement-based public sector economy in order to absorb the investments. A labor movement that led the colonization project in Palestine, especially since the second, most politicized, wave of Jewish immigration, 1904-14, directed the establishment of the state and orchestrated the building of and pervaded state institutions, started to lose ground to the Jewish nationalist right wing, especially after the War of 1973. In that phase, this trend was supported by a rising urban middle class and the majority of the Sephardi and Mizrahi, Oriental Jewish, population, holding the European, Ashkenazi, leadership of the country responsible for its misery. This section of their population supported the nationalist populist wing of the Ashkenazi political elite, who came across less patronizing to the mass of Sephardi and Mizrahi, Oriental Jews. The June War reshaped the image of Israel, just as it reshaped that of the Arab world. The war erected a great deal of international solidarity with their victorious victim against their vanquished aggressor, a couple of magic words that people mired in a supercile understanding of either victimhood as such or aggression on its own are unable to grasp. Being just a victim is not enough to inspire solidarity and spark the media's imagination, as has been proven time and again. Apparently victory, or winning in general, elicits more sympathy from international public opinion than victimhood, real or imagined. No other occupation beginning in the second half of the 20th century, during the age of decolonization, has lasted for more than whole years. The fact that Israel's direct occupation, which the rest of the world also recognizes as an occupation, has endured so long raises an important question about the meaning of dealing with Israel as a normal state within the 1967 borders and an occupying state only outside of those borders. Israel is more than 70 years old. Only 19 years of these were spent within the original truce lines up to the war on the 5th of June 1967. Which, then, is the exception and which the rule? It is neither logical nor natural to consider their normal Israel to be Israel as it once was for less than 20 years, rather than as it has been for more than y. Moreover, even if we accept this distinction for argument's sake, the Israel of 1948 to 67 was not a normal country that then occupied an area 102 times its size in June 1967. Even before 1967, it was the product of a solar colonial movement's military occupation. 34. Perhaps the Israelis themselves were taken by surprise by the swift and overwhelming victory that year. Their natural next step was to rally from the shock and secure political gains from the victory, and their most important object was to secure Arab acquiescence to the existence of the Israeli state without having to compromise on the Palestinian question. Eshkol's government was ready to bargain for peace settlement with Egypt and Syria, using its territorial spoils of war to barter with. No state could accept such a humiliating trade-off. At the time, the Palestinians and the Colonialism with Arab states were separated in Israeli political thinking, which considered the former a peripheral matter relative to the latter. 2 days after the war, Eshkol told the Knesset, a new situation has been created, which can serve as a starting point in direct negotiations for a peace settlement with their Arab countries. 35 a week later, on the 19th of June, the Israeli cabinet adopted a resolution proposing to offer Egypt and Syria the territories they had just lost in exchange for a long-term contractual peace. Cabinet Resolution 563 read, A. Egypt, Israel proposes signing of a peace agreement with Egypt and with Syria in point B, based on the international border and the security needs of Israel. 36 Is offer did not address the Palestinian roots of the Colonialism, but was still labeled a generous peace offer, and rumors circulated that Cairo and Damascus immediately rejected it. 37 In fact, the offer itself was action created by Israel's foreign minister at the time, Aber Ibn. The offer was never presented to the Arabs. A cabinet resolution was mainly a diplomatic ruse to gain American political support in the United Nations against the Soviets, who were about to propose a resolution calling for Israel's immediate and unconditional withdrawal from the territories occupied in the 1967 war. 38 Arabs summed up their response to the defeat in what became known as "Re-Nos" of the Khartoum Resolution: no negotiations, no reconciliation and no recognition. 39 resolution, adopted in the summit held in the Sudanese capital on the 29th of August 1967, stated that the participants agreed to make a concerted effort to engage in political work internationally and diplomatically in order to eliminate the results of 103. The war and ensure the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Arab lands occupied are the 5th of June 1967, within the framework of the basic principles to which the Arab countries accompanied: no peace with or recognition of Israel, no negotiations with it, and insistence on the Palestinian people's right to their homeland. 40 is statement there at the defeat and rejected capitulation. However, the Arab countries were still pragmatic in their response to U.S. initiatives. 4. Example, Nasser accepted the Rogers Plan in December 1969. 41 Israeli post-war thinking encountered a challenge at another level, a surge in Palestinian nationalism and armed resistance factions. It came, moreover, at a time when Arab people throughout the region were searching for a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness of defeat, despair, and even cultural shock. Israel remained dogged in its refusal to comply with the 242 Security Council's resolution and to accept the two basic prerequisites for peace: the right of the Palestinian refugees to return and Israeli withdrawal from East Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and other parts of the West Bank. In the celebratory government meeting held the day after the war ended, on the 11th of June, the status of United Jerusalem was an item on the agenda. A few weeks after the war, the Knesset adopted 3 legislative acts to extend its jurisdiction over the occupied eastern sector of the city. ERST Act, which was issued on the 27th of June 1967, stated that the law, jurisdiction, and administration of the state shall extend to any area of Eretz Israel designed by the government by order. It was in fact an amendment, number 11, to the Law and Administration Ordinance of 1948, and was applied the very next day to a new area of Jerusalem and its vicinity, stretching from Kalandia Airport, just south of Ramallah, southward to the Arab villages of Sarbar and Beit Safarfar, and west to east from the armistice line eastward to the villages Anarter, Olram, and Ultur. A new designation was enacted on the 28th of June 1967, in accordance with Article IIB of the Law and Administration Ordinance, 1948 as amended, and a chart indicated the new boundaries. On the same day, the Knesset passed another amendment extending the municipal jurisdiction of West Jerusalem under the title Enlargement of the Area of the Jerusalem Municipality. 42 In July 1980, the Israeli Knesset enshrined the annexation constitutionally as it enacted their basic law, Jerusalem the capital of Israel, by 104. Which it proclaimed that Jerusalem, whole and united, is the capital of Israel. And the city will remain forever under Israel's sovereignty. 43 Instead of becoming more exable or a victory that should have allayed its existential fears, Israel hardened its positions towards the Arab countries and continued to ignore the Palestinian issue. A hubris of victory and the experience of dominating another people blinded decision-makers and wider sectors of the public. On the morrow of the Egyptian and Syrian occupied in 1967, the leadership of Israel's ruling Labour Party was divided over whether or not to construct and annex settlements, ostensibly to establish secure borders. None of the leading gurs in the party recognized that there was a Palestinian issue to solve. Between September 1972 and April 1973, on the eve of the elections to the 8th Knesset, the Labour Party held a lengthy discussion on the future of the West Bank. A grand debate, as it was dubbed, re-acted between the leading Labour Party gurs. ERST group, represented by Yigal Allen, Pinchos Sapir and Aber Eben, 44 advocated what they called territorial compromise, Farah territorialit. A compromise entailed splitting the West Bank between Israel and Jordan, whereby the former would annex most of the Jordan Valley from the river to the eastern slopes of the West Bank Hill Ridge, East Jerusalem and the Etzion Block, while leaving the remaining parts containing most of the Palestinian population to Jordan. A second group, represented by Israel Galilee and Moshe Dayan, 45 advocated intensive development, i.e., colonizing the occupied areas without changing its official territorial status. 46 Eventually, the second group's Galilee plan became de facto Labour Party policy in 1973. Moshe Dayan was the only minister who implicitly advocated turning the newly occupied territories into a solution to the Palestinian problem in creating a direct contact with traditional local leaderships. His Open Bridges policy opened a civilian passage to Jordan and provided the inhabitants of the occupied West Bank with some much-needed breathing space. These bridges did not connect to Israel and did not allow any passage to or from Israeli areas. 47 He cultivated links with Palestinian mayors and other local leaders in order to construct an alternative leadership to the PLO and transition to some form of self-rule. Note that this was 10 years before the Egyptian-Israeli Camp David Agreement proposed its model for autonomy, or self-rule. Perhaps. 105. Dayan's decision to leave the Labour Party in 1977 and subsequently to join the Begin government presented him with the perfect opportunity to apply his ideas in partnership with an Arab state, Egypt, which entered into bilateral talks with Israel on Palestinian self-rule in the West Bank and Gaza. While Arab politicians honed the rhetoric of recovering the territories, Israeli politicians debated the fate of their territories, turning this issue into just another aspect of Israel's internal political landscape. Meanwhile, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were sucked into the occupation machinery. The Palestinians suffered the hard and brutal realities of the occupation. Rough, relentless state violence, Israel subjugated the entire population of Palestine to its political sovereignty. On the one hand, it integrated the occupied people into its domestic economic system while keeping total control of the occupied territory's natural resources and skies. On the other, it created the mechanisms and institutions that forcefully imposed ethnic separation, with two systems of rights and two judicial systems. A prolonged occupation of the West Bank and Gaza with its two phases of integration and separation, combined with the inherent contradictions between the Israeli state's Jewish character and criteria for formal citizenship, gradually turned Israel to an apartheid-like state. In conclusion, the contemporary state of Israel is politically, culturally and economically not just a product of 1948, but also of 1967. The same can also be said about Arab political culture, which now had a devastating defeat syndrome to overcome. The October 1973 war and the armed Palestinian resistance movements before and after that war would help to some extent. A socio-political impact of the 1967 defeat on the Palestinian cause was revolutionary. Foremost among the repercussions was the rise of the PLO or the defeat of pan-Arab regimes. However, this development simultaneously presented an opportunity to throw the burden of the cause onto the PLO and eventually to reduce the entire Palestinian question to just the West Bank and Gaza. Can separate peace be a model for the Palestinians? The 1973 October War was intended, at least as Egypt saw it, to recover national dignity and force Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories in the framework of a political process. After that war, which ended with a partial victory and partial defeat for both sides and after which the military option was abandoned, different kinds of peace talks were initiated. Recuperating their 106 territories required American mediation and experience in Israeli affairs, including expertise in Israeli internal politics, parties, coalitions, elections, etc., in order to discern Israeli plans regarding a possible compromise solution and how willing Israel was to negotiate. His new direction could only lead to separate peace treaties with each frontline Arab state. There is a fundamental difference between demanding Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories using united threats of force and other collective tactics, and making that same demand at the negotiating table in exchange for political concessions, such as recognizing and entering into peace with Israel while ignoring the question of the refugees and the parts of the West Bank that Israel wants to annex. What the new direction also meant was that the Israeli War of 1967 had effectively achieved its aims since, afterwards, Arab states became willing to renounce their pre-1967 demands and aspirations. The other Arab countries rejected Egypt's bilateral peace treaty with Israel. Algeria, Syria and Iraq led the regional pressure campaign that forced the monarchies to comply as well. But a key development, just over a decade later, would expose the Arab world to the full ramifications of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 shattered the old Arab regional order, and it ultimately swept aside all official Arab objections to Egypt's separate peace with Israel. The PLO was also influenced by these broader political shifts. It gradually segued into a Palestinian regime seeking formal statehood through a separate peace agreement with Israel. Israel was ready to return the occupied Sinai to Egypt in exchange for long-term peace with the biggest Arab country, without which Syria could not feasibly go to war against Israel. The PLO did not realize that Israel's approach, in which it wanted to drop Egypt from Arab military equations even at the cost of returning the Sinai Peninsula, did not apply to the PLO. A peace with Egypt had brought an end to conventional wars between Arab states and Israel. Israel's only wars since then have involved non-state actors, Hezbollah and Hamas. Before President Sadat signed the 1978-9 Camp David peace accords with Israel, an important development took place in the PLO. After the 1973 war, the PLO had begun to acquire unprecedented international recognition as a 107 national liberation movement and as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, despite a counter-campaign launched by Israel and the US depicting the PLO as a terrorist organization. During this period, the PLO saw possible Arab-Israeli peace talks aiming to recover the territories as a chance to promote the idea of Palestinian control of the West Bank and Gaza. The implicit argument was that if Israel withdraws from the occupied West Bank and Gaza, why should these territories be handed to Jordan and Egypt? Why not return them to the Palestinians? PLO leadership, which had become a symbol of steadfastness after the June 1967 defeat, was engaged in an armed struggle and could not compromise on the principle of the liberation of the whole of Palestine with the goal of establishing a single democratic state, so it encouraged the PLO's lowest factions, mainly the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or DFLP, to draw an agenda or a program or action plan on how to reach statehood. A so-called 10-point program called for the establishment of a national authority on every inch of occupied land to be liberated from the Israeli occupation. 48 is document represented a discursive step towards the wording of their two-state solution. Israel, as mentioned above, had its own agenda. It therefore rejected the idea of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza on the grounds that it would pose a threat to Israel's security. It also insisted that Israeli troops should be deployed along the borders with Jordan, where they remain today, and announced plans to annex existing settlement blocks and the Jordan Valley. Also in this period, the PLO clashed with Jordan over political representation of the Palestinian people. Egypt and other Arab countries stood by the PLO and, consequently, the 1974 Arab League summit in Rabat declared the PLO to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. PLO did not, and probably could not, grasp that this was the beginning of the separate peace process soon to be launched by Egypt. Exclusive representation decision that the PLO struggled so hard to achieve was later used by Egypt and Jordan to free themselves from their duty to help retrieve Palestinian territories lost in war, i.e., the West Bank and Gaza. Since the 1991 Madrid Conference, which was actually convened by the US, and the culmination of efforts made by Foreign Secretary James Baker in the aftermath of the RST Gulf War, or the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, the pursuit of a separate peace, on the basis of their land for peace formula, has 108 become the official Arab and Palestinian position. His approach was reiterated in the negotiations that were continued in Washington between a Palestinian-Jordanian delegation and Israel, and between Syria and Israel. In 1993, a secret negotiations track was conducted in Oslo and Israeli and PLO teams agreed on mutual recognition and declaration of principles. Is resulted in establishing a separate formal negotiations track between Israel and the PLO. 49 hence, Jordan negotiated its own peace deal with Israel separately, while the PLO continues to negotiate. How did an occupation help the occupier evade their colonial question? In general, today, colonialism is squarely framed in the context of decolonization and the internationally recognized right of occupied peoples to resist occupation in pursuit of national liberation. However, the case of Palestine is treated as an exception. In Western discourse, including among the mainstream law in Europe, e.g., Social Democrats, Palestine is a thorny dilemma requiring creative solutions. It has been disassociated from other cases of national liberation and connated with border disputes, various contemporary cultural and religious problems, and Europe's own Jewish question. Is overly complicated and complicating framing has stood between Palestine and any practical decolonization project. It has even become a countervailing force against any lasting peace settlement. Rather than help creative solutions replace decolonization as a framework for a resolution, the passage of time helped the emergence of an apartheid-like system of ethnic Discrimination. As innovative efforts continue to fail to bridge the gap between Israeli intransigence and a mediated path to any form of genuine justice, the struggle against the occupation continued and the Palestinians introduced creative methods of resistance, most notably the grassroots uprising. Intifada no longer needs translation in many world languages. A culture of the age of anti-colonial struggle is rooted in the belief that resisting occupation is an intrinsic right enshrined in international law and is also a duty of the occupied people. Modern decolonization processes were rooted in the international recognition of the inalienable right to self-determination of colonized peoples everywhere. As anti-colonial legal frameworks evolved and independence movements gained momentum, occupying powers scrambled to end ad hoc solutions to the dilemma of 109. Maintaining control versus bearing the mounting costs of occupation that prolonged native resistance might imply. From the Arab perspective, the liberation of Palestine was framed, from the outset, as a struggle between colonialism versus an Arab national independence movement. EGHT for liberation was understood to be the task of both the Palestinian and the Arab people, who were exhorted to help resist a foreign occupation of part of the Arab homeland. In this framework, the Palestinian struggle became not just an Arab issue but the central Arab cause. It became a chief symbol for the broader realm of shared Arab concerns, because it was also a microcosm of other national problems: division, subjugation, foreign domination, Arab fragmentation, and the weak legitimacy of ruling regimes. When Arabs demonstrated solidarity with the Palestinians, it was not just at the human level, but also at the political strategic level. Talk of Arab solidarity with Palestine was irrelevant, it was already a common struggle. Nevertheless, our 1967, when the Arab focus led to the recuperation of Arab countries' land occupied by Israel, the Sinai and the Golan, the Con-ICT was reframed as a standard border dispute. Quickly followed attempts to project this framing onto the Palestinian question. A same process that led to bilateral negotiations and separate peace agreements between Arab countries and Israel led to the reduction of the Palestinian cause to a Palestinian-Israeli dispute, and, before long, to its further reduction to a border Con-ICT, to be solved, creatively, of course, through bilateral negotiations, the outcomes of which were determined not by principles of justice, but rather by relative balances of power. Pan-Arab support for the PLO was initially meant to support independent Palestinian decision-making. Ironically, this would change or a consensus was reached in the 1974 Rabat summit to cede authority to the PLO as their sole legitimate political representative of the Palestinians. It should be stressed that the PLO's eagerness for autonomy was not entirely motivated by aspirations for prestige, influence, or other such whims. It was also necessitated by Arab governments' constant and connecting meddling in the organization's internal affairs. After the 1991 Madrid conference, Yasser Arafat continued to manifest this trend with his insistence on separating the Palestinian negotiating delegation in Washington from its Jordanian counterpart. 50 What was the result? A separate and comprehensive Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement and a 110 muddled and blundering Palestinian-Israeli peace process lacking even a minimum of shared understanding between Israel and the PLO. A process still has not ended. Nearly 3 decades after Jordan and Israel signed their bilateral peace deal in 1994. The Arab paradigmatic share has contemporary echoes. Take for instance official Arab regime responses to the ongoing blockade of Gaza. During four Israeli wars on Gaza, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2021, the Arab regimes were split between those expressing solidarity with the Palestinians and those holding them responsible for incurring Israel's wrath. When the Gazan people's anger and frustration at the blockade erupted in 2008 and furious crowds stormed the Rafah crossing between Gaza and the Sinai, Cairo was caught off guard. In order to defend and promote its official position on facilitating the blockade and contributing to its success, which did not enjoy popular support, the government invoked national defense and drummed up Egyptian patriotic sentiments against Palestinian incursions into Egyptian territory. PA President Mahmoud Abbas urged with this rhetoric. In a speech to commemorate Yasser Arafat's death, he used the word invaders to describe demonstrators who spontaneously rallied to protest the blockade at one of its harshest levels before the war on Gaza in 2008. 51 two kinds of positions or views coexisted in the years or the Madrid Conference. One reacts the myriad interests of Arab regimes that disengaged themselves and their states from collective political identification as Arabs with shared national security concerns, interests and positions. The other reacts the desire of the political leadership of the PLO to itself become an Arab regime. Convergence between the two resulted in the idea of leaving the Palestinian issue to the Palestinians. Arab governments welcomed the PA as an Arab regime, as they welcomed the PLO in 1974, because they could then shunt responsibility for the Palestinian issue onto the PA and PLO. It made it easy for them to fall in with the political transformation of Palestine from an occupied Arab land to a Palestinian-Israeli border dispute. A Palestinian problem became RST there. Palestinians' problem, then the problem of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are its discursive share from a colonial liberation struggle to a struggle for separate political entity. It thus morphed from solidarity with a resistance drive aimed at national liberation to a half-hearted search, together with the international community and the Israelis, for technocratic solutions to their 111 problem. Is search evolved into negotiations between the occupied and an occupier who refuses to accept that the only reasonable subject of negotiation is how to end their occupation. The negotiation segued into an ongoing political process in which solutions and exit strategies are done according to prevailing balances of power. As for the only acceptable negotiating partner to the occupier in this process, it is Palestinian political elites who can be extorted into making their people pay the price for preserving the status quo. In this context, according to the new paradigm, Arab pundits and politicians rely heavily on such notions as international legitimacy and the international community. These terms represent alternate, virtual worlds separate from the real world. The international community is not even an imagined community. It is merely a political term purpose to serve their current balance of powers. A two-state option as a solution to be achieved through negotiations is the result of the altered context which is characterized by the search for technocratic solutions to an unfathomable dilemma. The irony is that what made the Arab regimes and PLO relinquish the liberation struggle and accept the idea of a two-state solution, which by definition marginalizes the right of return, was their willingness to accept mediation rooted in international power balances, which effectively translates into exclusive dependence on US foreign policy. It is precisely what enabled Israel to render this same solution meaningless by refusing to withdraw to the 1967 borders, including East Jerusalem, insisting on maintaining its settlement clusters in the West Bank, and refusing to acknowledge the right of return to the Palestinians. Today, peace process negotiations continue to be obstructed by these three Israeli no's. If the framework of US-mediated negotiations gave Israel legal incentive to show some genuine exibility, the above-mentioned gradual rightward sharing. Israeli society since 1967 towards the ultra-nationalist and religio-nationalist ideologies ensured that Israel would dig in its heels further, but that its colonialist, expansionist tendencies would gain impetus. Not only were these growing right-wing segments of Israeli society suffused with the euphoria of power and victory, they grew fearful to the point of hysteria of losing the territories seized in that war and proceeded to found various radical right and religious movements dedicated to the cause of annexing the West Bank. Perhaps the best known is the Gush Emunim movement, which then splintered. (112) Off into even more radical secular movements. At the same time, there was a growing perception amongst an increasingly fanaticized public that their biblical land of Israel was nowly, thanks to the war, interlinked with their modern state. 52's idea reverberated across Israeli public discourse, causing the secularist and religious dimensions of the Zionist project to interlock, leading to a growing fusion between the state's secularist discourse and politics and religious frames of reference. The most dangerous aspect of this was the fusion of nationalist and religious extremism in Israel, something which Arabs struggled to understand, since in Arab countries political religious radicalism and nationalism are ideologically antithetical. It was at this time of the Israeli shift towards the religio-nationalist extreme right and closer Israeli-US bonding that the Arab regimes became caught in the game of American domestic politics. Suddenly, a returning acceptance of American international hegemony into a strategy for peace dependent on US pressure on Israel, they discovered that Israel is a domestic issue in America. 53 is generally means that the former exerts pressure on the latter by manipulating its internal politics. His thesis is disputed, of course. Chomsky, for example, calls it a myth that exonerates American foreign policies, arguing that the Israeli lobby in the US is strong because of the American policy in the Middle East and not the other way around. 54 others made an effort, a courageous one, at least in American academia, to demonstrate how influential the Israel lobby is. 55. Before them, some American politicians. 56 expressed their disapproval of the Israeli lobbies growing in UN's on congressional decision-making through announcing electoral campaigns, agitation and intimidation. 57 Former President Barack Obama spoke frankly about the influence exerted by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, on elected American politicians by either enticing them with votes and fundraising or menacing them with threats of potential accusations of being anti-Israeli or even anti-Semitic. 58 He said that the tactics used by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to lobby for certain policies exasperated him and put him on the defensive, noting that this actually turned Israel into a domestic issue by reminding me that normal policy differences with an Israeli Prime Minister. 113 exacted a domestic political cost that simply did not exist when I dealt with the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, Canada or any of our closest allies. 59 It seems that both views are correct. The Israeli lobby is well organized and very influential. Yet, although American alignment with Israel doubled its influence in US domestic politics, Israel would not determine American policies if the underlying strategies behind these policies consciously changed. Seen from their perspective, Chomsky is right. It may be very difficult for the White House to ever reach the decision to voluntarily exert real pressure on Israel, but if and when it nowly does decide to impose at least a semi-just peace, then the Israeli lobby would not be able to block it. Political pluralism and cultural changes in the American Jewish community should also be taken into consideration here, particularly in light of how Israeli policies are alienating more and more American youth, including Jewish youth, a trend that acquired impetus from the Trump-Netanyahu alignment and from Israel's alliance with right-wing evangelical fundamentalists. From this perspective, those pushing the idea among the Arabs that this or that American administration will never prioritize the Palestinian issue if the PLO and Arab regimes do not make further concessions erroneously assume that American involvement is the only way to pressure Israel. The idea plays to Israel's advantage. During most of the presidential terms that saw growth in American public interest in the region, pressure on the Arabs and Palestinians to make further concessions to Israel grew in tandem. American involvement is important, but it is not an alternative to Palestinian strength. Only the RST Intifada and, with some Arab pressure, during the 1990 Gulf War was American pressure noticeably exerted on an Israeli government. 60 Arab and Palestinian political forces that opted for their political process as an exclusive strategy based on the goodwill of American presidential administrations, while always holding their breath for the next one, sometimes also focused on the internal power play between the Israeli and right. Israeli has gradually shrunk, while the right has either dismissed peace as unrealistic or supported it cynically as an instrument to increase Israeli power and promote Arab capitulation. But both sides of the Israeli domestic political spectrum have been consistently united on the principle of keeping the most land with the least Arabs on it, which, in turn, 114 means giving up the least possible amount of territory and the largest possible number of Arabs. This common principle underpins the current Israeli political consensus, although it is hardly a good basis for peace or even for an unjust settlement. Israeli governmental approval of any peace settlement is contingent on the extent to which it is compatible with the prevailing domestic consensus. Should the Palestinians accept this as a condition for peace, they would have to accept the Jewish nature of Israel, renounce the right of return and drop any aspirations to retrieve Jerusalem, in addition to discarding any other lingering Arab delusions. In keeping with the plans to keep as much land as it can with as few Palestinians as possible on it, Israel continues to intensify settlement construction and build highways and ring roads to connect the areas it intends to annex to each other and to the urban centers inside the Green Line. In Israel, urban planning and construction policies are still conducted with their mentality of a colonial southeast drive, and this drive is defended by the Israeli state's security and foreign policies. In Israel, the logic of state does not just contradict the mentality of an expansionist colonial settler movement, the two fully complement each other, existing side by side in the same government and implementing different aspects of the same policy. To conclude, the separate peace negotiations by each Arab country to restore land occupied in June 1967 signaled that Israel had achieved the goals of that war. A model could not be applied to other Arab countries because once Egypt was out of the military equations, no more Arab wars against Israel were possible, and Israel no longer had an incentive to withdraw to its pre-1967 borders. EPLO's aim to follow suit by turning the Palestinian liberation cause into an Israeli-Palestinian territorial dispute rendered the pursuit of justice dependent on relative balance of power with Israel and on the complex American-Israeli relationship. It took a long time for the colonial question to reappear with some force in the political discourse. Only years of peace process dead ends did it once again become clear that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza could not be reduced to a border dispute because it is an extension of a colonial policy that took the form of a system of ethnic discrimination and separation.